Hello, I'm Marlene Saeed. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, 2024 will be the year of elections. Around 2 billion voters will be heading to the polls to pick their governments this year. What will this mean for many struggling with the cost of living crisis? Inflation and high interest rates are hurting millions. What more can central banks do? And will we see the end to high rates, or is this the new normal? Plus, disruptions in the Red Sea caused by Iran-backed Houthi rebels has seen the price of sending goods around the world spike. We examine the threat to the global economy. 2024 is promising to be a big year for elections. Around half of the world's population will be heading to the polls. No continent is exempt from what's expected to be a year that could shape the future world order. So what does this year have in store for the global economy under the umbrella of so much potential political change? We'll also be looking at the impact of the rising cost of shipping because of tensions in the Red Sea. Barbara Ngopa begins our coverage.
Voters across at least 64 countries will be choosing their leaders and governments in 2024. More than 2 billion people are eligible to vote in what's being billed as the biggest year in global election history. Bangladesh returned Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina for a fifth term this month in the first of those votes. Other Asian nations holding elections include Pakistan, Indonesia, Sri Lanka and India. One of the most fiercely contested will be in Taiwan. The outcome is likely to have implications for both the US and China as they compete for influence in the region. US ally Taiwan considers itself independent, but Beijing says the island is part of its territory, to be taken by force if necessary. Elections for members of the European Parliament are to take place in June, with far-right parties gaining popularity. More than 400 million voters are eligible to elect 720 MEPs across 27 countries. Since the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, the European Union has struggled to bring rising food and energy prices under control and to boost sluggish economic growth. Inflation in the bloc's largest economy, Germany, rose at the fastest rate in the last 3 months of 2023, dampening expectations that the European Central Bank will cut interest rates soon.
It will be at best towards the end of this year, 2024, because the ECB has to look not only at underlying inflation, but also at headline inflation. Who knows where that will stand in 6 or 9 months, because we don't know where oil prices will be going. And that's, I would be very cautious to predict rate cuts.
In the world's largest economy, US President Joe Biden is hoping to secure a second term in elections in November. His Republican rival Donald Trump is also planning a return to the White House. Events such as the outcomes of wars in Gaza and Ukraine, along with possible political transitions, will determine economic trends. And many taxpayers may be hoping for a few political sweeteners before deciding their next government. Barbara Ngopa for Counting the Cost.
We're joined now by John Harrison. He's Managing Director at Global Data TS Lombard. Alongside him is Brendan O'Connor. He's Professor of US Politics and Foreign Relations at the University of Sydney. Welcome to the show, both of you. John, let's start with a broader outlook for the year. According to the World Bank, it's high borrowing costs and political uncertainty around the world that is likely to dominate. Do you agree?
Yes, I mean, these are certainly important factors. And markets, of course, financial markets have been very volatile at the start of the year, but that doesn't really detract from our overall macro outlook, which is one of moderately slower GDP growth, gradual disinflation, which of course will be good for consumers, and ultimately lower interest rates. So that side of things should improve. And there are risks, of course. Inflation could have a resurgence. Shipping costs, for example, are in focus at the moment. Oil prices could also re-emerge as a threat. But overall, we think that with US US inflation quite close to 3%, that the Fed will be more biased towards cutting rates rather than allowing the economy to slip into recession. In Europe, perhaps the possibility of rate cuts could be delayed. There are hawkish members of the ECB that could push back if there is a slight uptick in inflation. And in China, we see downside risks to growth there because of the unpredictable nature of policy making and also the property sector crisis. But overall, it's a picture of slightly slower growth, less inflation, and ultimately lower interest rates.
And John, what about towards the end of the year? Do you see a slightly better picture by then?
Yes, I mean, economies, once these lower interest rates, if they do start in Q2, as we expect, then by the time we reach the end of the year, then, economies should be picking up, or markets should be doing much better as a result of that. But of course, we do have the elections, particularly in the US, and so there is a risk of geopolitical tension. But from a purely economic perspective, the feed through of lower interest rates and lower prices should be good for consumers and good for economic growth.
This is a good point to turn to you, Brendan. As we've been discussing, as John has been saying, a big year for elections this year. Let's start with the West. Which ones are you watching closely?
Well, the US election is where I have my expertise, and I suppose many people follow it not just as political scientists or academics, but almost as kind of sport. When Donald Trump is involved, it's become popular culture that the US has become, in some ways, seen as a bit of a political circus over the last decade, and particularly since the rise of Donald Trump. So many people economically, I suppose politically, socially, will be asking, can Trump be re-elected as US president? That would have seemed unlikely, I think, when he got defeated in 2020, but the possibility is real. I mean, he's doing quite well in national polls. It's always crucial where you can win the key states in the United States, and he's a bit behind Biden in some of those key states, but improving over time and showing that he is a serious threat to Joe Biden. And Biden has a weakness on some economic indicators. Inflation has been pretty high during his presidency, getting up to 9% in 2022. So Biden is vulnerable. Similarly, there's probably likely to be an election in the United Kingdom late this year. That seems on the card. So two major sort of Anglosphere powers with elections that I think are more volatile in the United States. I think most people would see a very likely Labour victory in the United Kingdom, where the US election, I think for election experts at the moment, would largely see it as a toss-up. And the possibility of Trump returning, which is extraordinary, is very much likely.
We will talk a bit further about the US elections, but I do want to ask you about the elections in the emerging markets. Is there any particular country that is standing out for you, perhaps Taiwan?
Yeah, the Taiwan election is crucial. I mean, it did look for a time that there'd be three candidates. Now it's a kind of seemingly the old battle between the two major parties. So I think there would be a sense of bated breath if there was more talk of independence, which seems less likely in this election. I think a more compromised position seems to be the more dominant and popular position. So that election always crucial in Taiwan, and how China reacts to the Taiwanese elections is always a crucial sort of geopolitical hot point to keep a focus on.
What about you, John, from the emerging markets? What are investors paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of elections, obviously, in Taiwan, I can make a few comments on that. I mean, we do expect the ruling, the incumbent DPP to gain the presidency, but may lose control of Parliament. So that may mean that passing legislation is perhaps quite difficult. And this will not be something that will be approved of by China in terms of the DPP candidate. That's likely to be an increase in tensions, but this will be perhaps more of the same of what we've seen. So incursions into Taiwan's airspace, perhaps some trade tariffs and so on. But there will also be carrots, if you like, to go along with that in terms of perhaps relaxation of rules on travel and on working and so on. But overall, some uncertainty and therefore some risk of tensions and some risk of volatility in financial markets as a result. I mean, of course, there are many other elections to keep an eye on. The most important ones, perhaps India, also Mexico, that we can discuss.
Turning back to the US economy, Brendan, so we have seen some improvement in the US economy in recent months. How much is that going to play into how voters decide on who they're going to vote for?
I mean, you would have thought it was remarkable that people weren't convinced of who they were going to vote for at this point, that people were out there thinking, I'm not sure if I support Trump or not. But there are, I think, new voters always coming in. There are voters who don't pay much attention to the news or politics, who are open to persuasion at the last minute or even to turn up to vote. And I think those people, often marginal in their economic standing and position and security, have probably felt it pretty tough during the Biden presidency because inflation rates lead to low-income people having to pay more for groceries, more for petrol. The possibility of wanting to take out a loan, get into the housing market has been difficult. So there are things that lead people to be critical of the current Biden administration. And in a two-party system, you get people, once they're critical, thinking, well, the other side might be a better choice, even if the other side is being told is the most sort of, irresponsible politician of a generation, or even in American history from kind of modern memory, being Donald Trump. So that kind of swing voter, which is a pretty small slither of the American population. I mean, most people are kind of calcified as Republicans or Democrats, but that swing vote could tip the election towards Trump. And there are a lot of people in America who find, themselves very marginally sort of placed economically. It's a tough society to live in, not much of a safety net in terms of welfare. So that appeal that things were better under Trump, which there's many arguments to make against that economically. There's many arguments to make the presidents are the dominant players in global economics or domestic economics. But Trump will, I think, be highly critical of Biden as an economic manager. And for some, I think, sort of low information voters, that's a potentially potent message.
John, from a market point of view, who is the better president? Is it Trump or is it President Biden?
I mean, I think in terms of predictable policy and volatile relations with China, which are obviously key for the global economy, and also relations with Europe as well, and then Biden would be better for financial markets, just purely because of more predictable and more amenable to friendly relations with with the rest of the world.
OK, it was really good to get both your perspectives. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you to John Harrison, Managing Director, Global Data, TS Lombard, and Brendan O'Connor, Professor of US Politics and Foreign Relations at the University of Sydney. Thank you both. The war in Gaza has led to the deaths of more than 23,000 Palestinians. Tensions are now threatening to spill over into the wider region. Iranian-backed Houthi rebels based in Yemen have been attacking shipping vessels in the Gulf that they say have links to Israel. The price of sending goods around the world has therefore risen significantly over the past 6 weeks because of these disruptions, and there are fears that fragile supply chains hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic may once again be threatened and push up consumer prices just as inflation is coming down. Well, the Red Sea is one of the world's most important shipping routes for oil and gas between Asia and Europe. In the south, the narrow Bab al-Mandab Strait between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula connects the Red Sea with the Gulf of Aden. 12% of the world's trade and 10% of global oil carried by ships goes through that strait. Now, the Suez Canal connects the Red Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. It's the shortest shipping route between Europe and Asia. 15% of the world's maritime traffic passes through the Suez Canal. Now, since November of last year, the Houthis have targeted vessels near Bab al-Mandab, forcing major shipping and oil companies to suspend operations through the Red Sea. So rerouted vessels will have to make a longer journey all the way down the east coast of Africa via the southern tip of the continent. OK, let's talk now to Ahmed Halal. He's an economic and political risk analyst and MENA director at the Global Council. Thank you so much for joining the programme. What has the impact of the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea since November had on shipping delays and shipping costs?
Well, naturally, freight rates have gone up, and insurance risk premiums, the companies that underwrite these vessels traveling into these risky waters, those premiums have gone up. The popular Shanghai to Rotterdam route, which transits the Bab al-Mandab and then onto the Suez Canal, the price of freight rates there have gone up 100%, 120%. So that will have cascading impacts. It'll lead to some inflationary pressures in the global economy, just as inflation was cooling down overall.
And just to be clear, when we're talking about these shipping containers, we're talking about them carrying everything from shoes to car parts. So everything becomes more expensive, essentially.
Absolutely. But the good news is that we haven't seen the massive lags and delays in the delivery of these goods, because supply chains have been rejigged since the COVID shock. Many of the producers, many of the suppliers, the customers of these shipping lines, the retailers, they all realize that they can't continue to rely on the dominant model of before, which was just-in-time delivery, to have very low stockpiles, very low inventory to keep costs down. They realize that they need to build redundancies into supply chains and make things in different countries so that they can be resilient. So actually, the supply chains have been remarkably resilient to this shock.
We have just started seeing inflation come down in many parts of the world. Is this going to be a problem, though? Is this going to start hitting where it hurts again?
It will with a lag. It depends also on how acute and how sustained these attacks keep happening. As long as the war in Gaza happens, as long as Israel continues to prosecute this campaign, I think the Houthis will keep attacking these vessels.
10% of the world's oil is also normally transported through these routes. So what kind of disruption are we talking to the oil and gas markets?
Well, we have to realize first that the Houthis aren't actually targeting fuel tankers. So oil and gas has been largely kept aside from this confrontation. So most of the fuel tankers, most of the fuel tankers actually are still continuing to transit the Suez Canal, and you haven't seen oil and gas prices being that sensitive. So they went up a little bit, but they come back down. More serious is the Strait of Hormuz, where most of the oil coming from this region transits, and that hasn't really been affected and hasn't been targeted. So there is no concern so far on energy security.
I wonder if that could change, because the United States has announced this multinational naval task force to patrol the southern part of the Red Sea. Are you concerned, or investors concerned at all, about some kind of escalation going on because of that?
Look, the scope for miscalculation in these waters is always going to be there. That risk is always going to be there. But if you look at the market fundamentals, oil, gas markets are very well supplied right now. The gas is supplied to Europe is very healthy. The US is producing energy at record levels, and Europe today is importing more and more gas from the US. There will be added costs because the tankers, the freight rates also for vessels that are moving energy around the world are going up. So you saw yesterday that Asian consumers, Asian buyers of oil are buying more from the region because it's a shorter distance than buying US crude, which is a much longer distance and will cost a lot more. So there are built-in effects.
Do you think that the attacks in the Red Sea by the Houthis will stop if the war in Gaza stops?
I do think so, but the war isn't going to stop anytime soon. The cabinet, the war cabinet, the security cabinet in Israel is talking about 12 months, maybe 24 months. It might go to a lower intensity confrontation with Hamas, but there's no end in sight. But I do think that they're timing it such that it continues during the war.
We have, of course, the US elections coming up this year, and as you have been saying, there is concern that the Gaza war will continue throughout the rest of 2024. How do you think the US elections are going to play into the war in Gaza?
American voters vote with their pocketbooks. They rarely vote on foreign policy issues. That has been, historically the trend. If we want to talk about the two candidates, if it's a Biden versus Trump ticket, it's very unpredictable what Trump will do, and he's very personality driven, and
and that's more risky.
That is more risky, but Netanyahu and Trump had quite a solid relationship. They negotiated the Abraham Accords, and Trump got that recognition for it, moved the embassy and so forth. But he had a bad end to the relationship with Netanyahu. He didn't. When Netanyahu congratulated Biden and recognized the victory, that's something that slighted Trump. So it's hard to predict how he will. That said, Trump is about America first. He's looking at, selfishly, what is this war doing to a narrow U.S. self-interest? He made it clear that on Ukraine, he will end the support. The U.S. will not cut a blank check to Ukraine. So one maybe looks at Israel a bit differently because of the ironclad link between those two countries. But I think he will have a more isolationist foreign policy in general.
What about the trade implications under Trump rather than Biden? Global trade, that is.
So Trump, I think, will continue this reshoring effort that Biden has introduced, these key pieces of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. It's all part of an attempt to bring manufacturing back onto America and to decouple as much from China and to depend less on global supply chains. It all goes back to the shock of COVID and the shortages of personal protective equipment and pharmaceuticals, the realization that America couldn't continue to rely on global supply chains. So trade will be affected in that way.
What about it was interesting under Trump, we saw very much a normalization of relations between Arab countries to Israel, and that came to stop very much because of the war in Gaza. Yeah. If we go back to Trump again, how do you see all that playing out?
It's hard to see more countries normalizing with Israel in this climate. Doesn't matter who's in the White House. The concessions that the Palestinians was in the first edition of the Abraham Accords were nothing but lip service, and occupation continues, the settlement building continues. So this grand bargain between Saudi Arabia and Israel, brokered by the U.S., is unlikely to happen anytime soon. And the concessions to the Palestinians and Palestinian statehood will be right at the center of that. So I think normalization will be very difficult for any Arab public and Arab government to pursue at this time.
But we've been talking about elections earlier in this program. We've talked about the U.S. election with you. There are a number of elections in the emerging markets this year. 2024 is one of the years where we'll see the most number of elections in the emerging markets. Are there any particular countries that stand out for you as particularly risky or one we should be paying attention more to? For example, we have South Africa, we have India, we have Taiwan, a number of emerging market elections.
So Taiwan, I don't follow the domestic. Taiwan is, for me, is the most important one. Because depending on the outcome and how pro-China or anti-China the winner is, it will affect how the U.S. looks at the Taiwan Straits. And as we know, Taiwan is incredibly important for the global economy because of its world-leading semiconductor industry. So that's one election that I would look at very closely. If the system in China looks at Taiwan and says that this is the year we're going to go for Taiwan and reunite it with mainland China because of the outcome of the elections, then that would be the most serious one, because we saw that some forecasts are putting the economic shock as $10 trillion economic shock if there's a war between Taiwan and China.
Finally, you are a risk analyst. That is your job, that is your trade, year in, year out. How would you compare 2024 from a risk point to, say, previous years? Sure.
Well, I'd say, so on the kinetic wars, hot wars that we're seeing geopolitical risk really spike. We have the war that's in the region that's spilling over. Lebanon is being drawn in, and Houthis in Iraq. We have the biggest conventional war in mainland Europe since World War II, and that continues to rage on with hundreds of thousands of casualties. And we have potentially what would be a catastrophic war for the global economy between Taiwan and China, which some analysts are saying isn't too far into the future. So I'd say that's on one hand. On the other hand, it's extreme weather events and the economic destruction that will happen with more unpredictable weather patterns, and you have the El Nino cycle, and you have threats to global food security and the migration effects that would have. So I think that's one really macro risk that I would be following closely.
Ahmed Halal, really, really good to get your perspective. Economic and political risk analyst and MENA director at the Global Council. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X. I am Marlene Saeed. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's lots more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our webpage, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. OK, that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Saeed. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera coming up next.